Well, those are what I call the good old days, and they've changed a lot since. But now I have a little story for you. You've all heard the story of rags to riches. Well, I'm going to call this story oysters to rags to riches. About 1958, we were starting to make a little money and we needed help. And I particularly needed help in the front office. I was doing the purchasing and the bookkeeping, and we needed someone else to give us an aid. So we saw this young lad that worked next door at the what was called the Oregon Oyster House. And each day I'd go by, I'd watch this young lad. He looked very ambitious. He always had a smile on his face, and he worked diligently. He was either shucking oysters or he was washing dishes. But every time I looked at him, he had a smile on his face. So finally I approached him. I said, "Why don't you come next door and work for us at the Portland Screw Company, and we'll teach you the difference between screws and oysters." And sure enough, the next morning, he was at the front door and before opening time. And he came in and sat down, and we showed him the warehouse and some of the things we wanted him to do back there. Then I brought him up front and I set him down at a typewriter, and he typed a few lines, and I said, "That's fine. Hours are 8 to 5, 5 days a week, $44 a week." And he looked at me and I said, "Don't say it." I said, "Remember, son, never let yourself be overpaid." This is a true story. And a few years went by, and after a series of raises, he came to me one day and he says, "Dave, I quit." And I said, "What do you mean you quit?" He said, "I'm being overpaid." And before I had a chance to lower his wages, he was out that door, and he was starting to open up his own business. In fact, in the next few years, he opened and closed several businesses, about one every 7 years, as I remember. I guess the message here is that if Jim Colbert had allowed himself to be overpaid, I wouldn't be standing here telling this story about him. Very successful businessman. He has his own operation, and I'm proud of him. So you can call that a success story or whatever you'd like to call it. And just to prove what I'm saying, this is I can't see what I'm looking at. You see, this is a young man with a smile on his face. Same smile that I saw at the very beginning. This was taken at the Fairmont Hotel, and I don't remember what year it was, but it was just before Jim felt he was overpaid. So that was, what year was it? 1962. And you might recognize on the right there a fellow named John Harrington that was with the Cleveland Cap Screw Company. He was one of our fine suppliers and a very good friend of mine. And then Bob Freer over here on the left. Now here's a classic picture of NFDA in 1972. I was invited to become a member, and this was taken at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, and they managed to squeeze a meeting in between gambling and golf, as I remember. And you have a rare picture. I'm the fellow sleeping there, and you have a rare picture of Larry Stanley when he's not making a speech. And then a little further up, you may recognize an even rarer picture of Virgil Anglin of Adams Supply when he's not playing golf. And then peeking over the side on the left here is little Mikey McGuire. Back in those days, they were a distributor out of Columbus, Ohio, Capital Sales, I think it was. But this was the first time I attended a meeting, and we had probably a total of 20 members at the time, and some of these were wannabe members, and most of us got in. But soon after this picture was taken, they asked me to be membership chairman. And not because I knew anything about membership chairman, but because I was the biggest distributor in the company. As far as size, I weighed the most. So they decided to pick me. There was another fellow that was bigger than I was, and that was Tom Veach, and he worked for Stan Screw. But he was a supplier, and in those days, suppliers were to be seen, not heard. So we didn't give them much authority. They spent most of their time buying us cocktails and dinner. But I actually spent 7 years on the board of NFDA. They kept assigning new jobs for me, membership chairman, finance chairman, and what the heck else? They had me as a bylaw chairman. They finally gave up and gave me some important things to do, like running the golf and tennis committee, and then the Dixieland committee. So that was my experience with NFDA. Probably one of the most rewarding experiences I've had in my career was my involvement with the formation and help in creating the association, WAFTA. I was one of the original people that met down there at Stevens Steakhouse 20 or 15 years ago. And we got there at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the intent was not necessarily to form the association, but to discuss whether we should or shouldn't. It was bad years. There was a recession going on, and we talked back and forth, well, shall we, or pros and cons. And I remember that 10 o'clock, then it was 11 o'clock, and we were still talking back and forth about whether we should or shouldn't. And then Mel Kirstner pipes up in the corner. He says, "You guys are gumming it to death." He said, let's form a search committee and get going on this. Well, to make a long story short, by 7 o'clock that night, we not only had an organization, we had a name for the organization, we had board of directors, we had the officers, and we had our first business meeting with Larry Stanley conducting it. And that was done within a period of 9 hours. That was quite an accomplishment in my mind. I'd like to make a comment about the early board meetings that we had. There were a lot of board meetings, as you can imagine, trying to get started, getting the organization going. And I'd like you to picture that smoke-filled rooms with Larry Stanley, Martin Calfee, Mel Kirstner, and Bob Lehman all in the same room, all at the same time, all talking, and all talking at the same time. And a couple of the more quiet members of the organization, Benny Benson and myself, I remember we ran up to at Lake Tahoe, we ran up to the jewelry store and got a small gavel for Larry, because he had been sitting around with a glass of water and a spoon trying to get some order going. So we gave him this gavel, and soon after that, the next meeting, Benny says, "My God, we should have got him a small cannon." But I'm just kidding. That first year was a lot of work for everybody, and we did it without an executive secretary. When it looked like I was in danger of becoming the next president, I pleaded with Larry. I says, "Hey, let's get an executive secretary in here quick," which he did. And for the first year, maybe year and a half, we had a lady named Lita Shattuck that was our executive secretary. And then she retired, and we were blessed with Vicki Lester. And I can't say enough about Vicki. She has done a wonderful job, talented, efficient, and pretty. That's what I have to say about Vicki Lester. Now I have some slides that I made up in remembrance of some of our past members that have passed on. This was my longtime friend and fellow employee, Dick Loska, which I believe most of you knew. There was an untimely sudden death last spring when I was attending the conference in Hawaii